Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my dear friends, the attention of the world is, of course, focused on the war in Iran, but I would like to focus again, after a break of several weeks, on the events in Ukraine, and specifically, my title today is The Fate of Ukraine, the Four Scenarios. Now, the discussion of what is going to happen next in Ukraine is in some way or another connected to the events around the war in Iran. But my attention here is what exactly are the choices, what are the decisions that could be made, and how the developments can take path, what path they would take in the Ukraine war. Now, let me start with the four scenarios, and the first one is the one that Zelensky wants and the establishment in Ukraine wants, and this is the same one that is preferable by the European elites, and I will call it the porcupine model. The reason for that is, as you may know, that the European Commission President von der Leyen called it that. She said that what she wants is that Ukraine turns into a porcupine, which means it's armed to the teeth, so that it becomes a bulwark against what she calls Russian aggression. That scenario of development envisions the agreement under which Ukraine has 800,000 army armed by the European Union, and it would have the first step is the $90 billion or euro loan that Ukraine doesn't have to repay unless the Russian reparations come for 2 years. We know that story has been going on for some time, but at this moment this money is blocked by Hungary because of the dispute over Russian oil that Ukraine blocks, and the Hungarians want to get it, and Hungary put a veto on the disbursement of these 90 billion. So this plan is not going very well, but the idea is that Ukraine prevails and it becomes kind of a European army shield against Russia. And especially the hotheads in London and in Berlin, they want time until 2030 to progress their rearmament program so that they're ready to confront the Russians, and Ukraine has a special place in this porcupine model. Now, obviously, as I mentioned in many of my previous videos, this is not going to work. This is the least likely scenario in my view, simply because of the Russian offensive, and that is unacceptable to Russia. This is why the special military operation is going on, because Russia will not allow to turn Ukraine into a bulwark of European war, NATO war against Russia. This is why the offensive is continuing, and it simply will not happen as long as Russia has military capacity for advancement. One other item in this porcupine model is that the Ukrainians themselves like to refer to it not so much as porcupine but as Israel model. They kept on saying all the time until this current war that they want to be like Israel. They want to have the same security guarantees as Israel does. They would like to have a situation when the United States were able to go to its defense and go to war as it did for Israel. Now, what this war in Iran has shown is that the United States is not in the capacity to stop Iranian missiles hitting Tel Aviv just as much as no amount of Western aid and billions of euros, dollars poured into Ukraine cannot stop Russian missiles targeting military installations in Ukraine. And the largest one of them was a couple of days ago when 1,000 flying objects of various kinds hit Ukrainian targets. So, my point, of course, is that this is the least likely of the four models to actually get realized. Now I go to the second model or scenario, which I call peace deal between Putin and Trump. That is the one that still, in my view, has a chance, a diminishing chance, but still a chance to be realized. So this is the plan that was first discussed in Anchorage, and the Russians refer to it as the spirit of Anchorage. And what it refers to is a compromise solution. Now, of course, the Russians consider it a compromise. The Westerners in Europe especially consider it Russian maximalist terms. But to remind you what these are, and that is that Russia gets 4 provinces plus Crimea, that is to say Donetsk and Lugansk and Zaporozhye and Kherson, the areas which they had parts of which they had taken back in 2022, and they still holding and expanding those today. Now, as of now, there's about 15% of Donetsk region or province left to be taken by the Russian army, about half of the Zaporozhye and about a third of Kherson. In other words, advancement is going on. That's the territory. But the most important part is not territory, but up until now, the most important point was no NATO membership for Ukraine, no foreign troops, a neutral status with neutral status of Ukraine, and the restoration of the language rights and rights of Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Up until quite recently, this was the plan. These were the Russian demands. And just about 2 months ago, there seemed to be a shift in Russian position, which added to it that Zelensky should be out. And that is because his term has expired, and increasingly hostile remarks towards Zelensky are to be heard in Russia. In fact, my colleague, Mr. Doctorow, he focused on the kind of a contradiction or kind of a different emphasis between President Putin and his entourage and his foreign policy establishment, and especially the military, being that Putin is definitely in favor of this negotiated settlement with Trump. And his establishment and his generals and his foreign policy establishment is increasingly leaning to a more favorable conditions for Russia, both in terms of territory, but especially in terms of no compromise with Zelensky. So their approach is the old Putin plan plus the end of Zelensky regime, and it is removal. Now, how could it be removed? Well, obviously the solution is in the elections. So one could say that Putin-Trump scenario can still be realized only in that if elections are held and if by some other way Zelensky's government, not just government, but Zelensky regime, which means all of his Bandera political movement associates are removed from power. Now, how could that be changed? Of course, there are many possible scenarios how that could be done, but the easiest is free and fair elections. And that is the plan that is discussed. In fact, even Zelensky is talking about presidential elections, and in a referendum over Donbas, that is still a possibility. So this is something that is at this point on the table. However, once and if there is a change of regime, we're in a totally different territory now, and that what brings me to a possibility of scenario number 3, which I call the Belarus model. The Belarus model basically means that not only Zelensky regime is removed, but also there are free elections, and in addition to the 4 provinces mentioned earlier, other provinces where Russian-speaking minorities live do become a part of the Russian Federation, such as Odessa and Kharkov and Nikolaev and maybe Dnipropetrovsk. So the Belarus model basically means that those who are the proponents of it, and I think former President Medvedev is one of those, and many of the generals, they insist that Russia should continue to Odessa and should, as they put it, liberate all of Russian-speaking areas of Novorossiya or New Russia. And that means the offensive continues. But then the question is, what happens to central Ukraine or the rest of Ukraine? And that is where the Belarus model comes up. And that means that the remainder of Ukraine is an independent state, but with limitations. It cannot be a member of NATO. It must have a government that is friendly to the Russian Federation by some kind of a treaty and economic ties like Belarus. And that also finds its proponents, amazingly enough, among many and some Ukrainian politicians, such as Mr. Aristovich, who had been saying all along that the only way for Ukraine to survive and to continue as an independent state is to have good neighborly relations with Russia. And he has been saying that the project of Ukraine as an anti-Russia failed. And the only way forward is that it should have its independence, it should be in charge of its own affairs and police and even an army and foreign relations, but within the confines of a military, political, and economic union with Russia on the basis of the status of European Union member states. In other words, that Ukraine should be a member of a union, but not the European Union, but the Eurasian Union with Russia. So that's the model of number 3. And now I move on to model number 4, or scenario of development number 4, and I call it Germany of 1945. So this version of events is likely to happen if nothing changes to the way things are now. Zelensky regime stays in power, or he is replaced by Zaluzhny, another Banderovite nationalist leader. The dictatorship continues, the banning of political parties continues, the war is going on, the mobilization, highly unpopular, is going on, the slow and steady Russian advance is continuing, and all of that is likely to end in the end in Kiev. And that's what the Russian generals are hoping for, and they call it a capitulation of Ukraine, or to use Mr. Trump's terminology, unconditional surrender. So that is the Germany of 1945. In that unconditional surrender scenario, what is likely to be is the end of Ukrainian statehood. In other words, very unlikely it is that the Russians would allow Ukraine to have a government of its own if after 4 or 5 years of fighting and enormous sacrifices in lives of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, they would not want to have any chances of ever facing a similar situation in the future, which means that Ukraine at best could hope for a autonomous status within the Russian Federation if that happens. However, this does not include West Ukraine. Moreover, Putin has said many, many times that he does not want West Ukraine inside Russia. This is the hotbed of Bandera movement, extreme anti-Russian nationalist movement, and they don't want to have it. What is going to happen with West Ukraine at this point is impossible to say. But it is important to emphasize that in West Ukraine there are pieces that were attached to it by Stalin in 1945. There is a piece of Hungary, a piece of Slovakia, a piece of Romania, and a piece of what used to be Poland before World War II. It is also possible that some form of partitioning of Western Ukraine could take place. And it could also be that some rump of it would remain as an independent country, and maybe Russians wouldn't even object if it joins European Union or maybe even NATO, because it is irrelevant. It would be a very small state, the size of Slovakia or smaller. So this is where we are in these projections, and the outcome will depend on the actions of Zelensky and the development of political events in Ukraine on the one hand, and on the speed and success or lack thereof of the Russian offensive. So I stop at that, my dear friends, and I want to remind you that in my playlist War in Ukraine, I have many videos discussing every aspect of this war in chronological perspective. I also invite you to consult my other playlists, such as Soviet history, post-Soviet history, Russian history, and others, personal narratives. And I also invite you to read my book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin. And if you're interested in history, my other books, another quite popular one is Russia After Lenin. They are all available on Amazon.com. And I finish on this note, and please write your notes, put your likes, answer the questionnaires that I put once in a while, and I will see you very soon again in another edition of Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin.